Hi everyone, my name is Ted Hulsy. I'm Vice President of Marketing at eFolder and your host for today's event. Welcome to our eFolder Expert Series. This webinar series brings together experts from eFolder's staff and partner community for deep dive discussions on key service and technical topics. Today's topic is BDR do's and don'ts. Today we are joined by Andrew Bensinger, CEO of Replibit. First, let's cover a few housekeeping items before we go through the agenda. Today's session is being recorded. The recorded version of the webinar will be made available on eFolder's YouTube channel. We will also make copies of the slides available to those who registered for the event. With over 125 people registered for today's session, we have put all participants in listen-only mode. You can enjoy the audio portion of today's event by either streaming it to your computer or by dialing in over the phone. Today's webinar follows a logical flow. After introducing our guests, we will go over best practices in building a disaster recovery plan and service. We will then discuss what hardware specs to consider when building a BDR solution that works. And finally, we will introduce eFolder BDR for Replibit and go into an interactive Q&A session in which you can ask Andy any questions you might have. Questions are strongly encouraged throughout today's discussion, and you may submit them as we go along, and we will try to address your questions on the fly. Your questions are what make these live events so interesting and interactive. So please ask questions as we go along. Okay, now let me introduce Andy. Andy is the founder and CEO of Replibit. Andy is a natural-born inventor and entrepreneur. In 2006, as an owner of an IT services and MSP company, Andy set out to solve the backup and disaster recovery problem that he and his customers faced, such as high prices and low reliability. Andy founded Replibit in 2012 to modernize the approach and architecture of the original solution and to provide MSPs and their customers with an affordable end-to-end business continuity solution. Andy graduated from the University of Maryland, College Park, and went on to receive a master's in education from the University of South Carolina, Columbia. Andy, thanks for joining us and welcome.
My pleasure. Thanks, Ted.
Okay. Andy, let me go ahead and give you keyboard and mouse control.
Perfect, thank you.
Okay.
All right, we'll give this a whirl. I want to thank everybody for taking their time to join us today. I know everybody's schedule is very hectic and very busy, so we really appreciate you carving out a little bit of your day for us. Today we're going to talk about, building a proper disaster recovery plan, regardless of what type of disaster recovery solution you're using. There's some variables that hold true across the board. Later in the discussion, we'll talk a little bit about some Replibit specific things that might come in handy if you opt to go with the Replibit solution, but some of this is going to be helpful regardless of the solution. It's very easy to say to your customer base that you're going to be providing disaster recovery as a service. You just simply, order the hardware, order the software, or it comes as a bundled unit, you install it, and then you walk away. Unfortunately, that is a setup for some problematic scenarios, and we're all in the business of problem mitigation. So with a little planning and foresight, you can really reduce the number of issues you have with the implementation of your disaster recovery as a service plan. So, step number one is you want to map out your live environment and figure out what you need. Step number two is really define your disaster scenario and have that discussion with your customer. It's all about making the SLA and ensuring you're meeting your customer's needs. You've spent a lot of time, effort, and money earning the goodwill with your customer base. And if you don't have these discussions in place about what the definition of disaster is and having all your ducks in a row, you're really putting yourself at risk of maybe burning that goodwill. And these are all easily mitigatable scenarios that you can address in advance. And then, of course, build the actual action plan. And we'll cover some more topics after that. But first, let's talk about mapping out the live customer environment. And Ted, there we go. Sorry about that. There's a slight delay there. So when you're speccing out the solution and having the discussions with your customer about installing disaster recovery as a service or switching the type of solution that you have in place to expand upon that, one of the key areas that we see, unfortunately, where partners can miss their SLA is by not taking the time to do an inventory of the customer's production network and really make a clear, solid determination of the hardware that's being utilized by the customer, because that's really going to dictate a lot of the hardware that you install. Now, we'll get into the installation of the hardware in a little bit, but take the time and map out the number of CPUs and the number of cores that the customer is using in their production environment. Take note of the memory. Most importantly, take a look at the storage. We all tend to overlook the storage, and we've found that in disaster scenarios, that tends to be one of the biggest mitigating factors in successfully meeting your SLA. And we all put out these SLAs that are very aggressive, and we do that to win the business. But if you haven't spec'd out your storage properly, and we'll go into great detail about that, you may wind up inadvertently missing this SLA. So take a look at what your customer has. I mean, how many spindles are they running? You know, what type of hard drives? Are they SATA drives, SAS drives, SSDs? Are they using iSCSI? Do they have low-end NASs, high-end SANs? What's the performance of all the solution, and how is it all interrelated? Because when you do have that disaster occur, all of this is going to come together and fall onto your BDR appliance, and you need to make sure that appliance can handle the load and meet the needs of what the customer is. You know, we want to mitigate a scenario where technically you've got these machines up and running. However, because the customer feels dissatisfied with the speed of the system or whatever it may be, emotionally they feel that you missed your SLA. And that's how you're going to lose a customer. So you really want to calculate all that stuff out before you start designing the solutions that you're going to put in place. And then you need to take a look at the servers themselves and see what roles they play and see, are there any specialized applications. Unfortunately, we, from time to time see tickets coming in where a customer has invoked a disaster, or a partner's invoked a disaster, but didn't take the time in advance to go and spec out that environment, and didn't realize there was some very proprietary hardware card in one of the servers. And when you spin it up as a virtual machine, that card doesn't exist. And there was key business function that was now missed. Although the server was up and running, they couldn't perform the task required by that particular machine. So you definitely want to take a look at that stuff. You want to see if there's any interesting licensing out there. There was a brief period of time where there were applications that were licensed on dongles, or they were bound to MAC addresses of NICs. These are all the things that you need to have in your plan laid out prior to the disaster, because if you have to do MAC address emulation or configure things for USB pass-through, you're going to want to test all that stuff in advance to make sure it works, because once again, it falls back to you spun up the machine, but if it's not serving the role that it was designed to do, you've missed your SLA, and you have the potential of losing a customer over it. So definitely take a lot of time and map this out. We highly consider putting together a spreadsheet, and so you have in advance, prior to the moment of disaster, the resources that each individual machine is going to take when you have to spin them up during an emergency, and the roles of each one of those machines, so you know exactly the purpose of each machine, and you can appropriately assign the resources. Now, when you do have a disaster, or prior to having a disaster rather, you really want to have a conversation with your end user about what their expectations are going to be during the moment of a disaster. Everybody, the end users don't understand the underlying technology and all the moving parts and pieces that are involved with declaring a disaster. In many cases, they just say, I lost a server, declare the disaster. Or sometimes our partner base actually makes a mistake and invokes a disaster at an inappropriate time. The example being, we had a customer who, during the lunch hour of their end user, made the decision that they were going to upgrade the RAM modules in a production server. I believe it was an Exchange server. So they declared a disaster, did an emergency virtualization of the production live Exchange server, shut down the production machine, dropped in the RAM modules, turned it back up, and didn't understand why there was a mismatch between this live production machine, and didn't fully comprehend the fact that at this point they now needed to do a full BMR back to the production system to get those emails out of the system, or they would have to upload cache files off of OSTs and things like that. So you really need to have a conversation with the customer about what is a disaster. You definitely don't want to declare disasters for those types of scenarios. You also want to talk about how long is time going to go by before you declare a disaster? The classic example we always see is you lose a rate control on a production machine. It could be their line of business application. You happen to have a 4-hour on-site warranty. Do you really want to declare that disaster? Because if you do, and you do the emergency virtualization, you now have all the associated expense of failing them back out of the emergency virtual environment and back to that original piece of hardware. And who's going to pay for that? Is that an all-in on your contract that now you or one of your engineers is going to be working all weekend long to BMR, a machine back, where something could have been mitigated by 4 hours of downtime with the on-site warranty? Or the other one we see a lot is, you lose a machine at 4 p.m., but they're closing at 6. Do you declare a disaster then and spend all the time, money, effort, energy, whatever it is, to spin them up in the emergency environment to then immediately fail them back? And you may want to consider baking into your service level agreements these types of scenarios, because there's a huge pressure from the end user onto you to go ahead and declare that disaster and do the emergency virtualization. But we see in many, many cases, all the costs associated with that are an all-you-can-eat, under an all-you-can-eat scenario. So you are now stuck responsible for paying that engineer all weekend long to fail the entire customer site back, when it was something that was really rather silly, where power was coming back on, shortly, a transformer blew or whatever, and you knew the power company was out there. You may not want to declare that disaster. So definitely have the discussion in advance with your partner that you want to be able to dictate when a disaster is declared. You are the technical expert. You are their advocate for their network, and it really should fall on you to be able to make the decision of whether to declare the disaster, and try to mitigate yourself being in a position of having to acquiesce to the desires of the end user, because that may not necessarily be the best decision. They don't necessarily know everything that's involved with declaring a disaster or not. Now, when you're building your plan when a disaster occurs, now once again, this is all done in advance, make sure you understand the order in which the servers need to come up. Also, with regard to that, if these are domain controllers, make sure you're booting these devices. That's clearly going to be your first machine in the order. Make sure you're booting these devices or the domain controllers in directory services restore mode, or DSRM. You can run into all sorts of issues if you don't do that. The most simple is, on boot, you're going to wind up with a blue screen, and you're going to have to reboot again and bring it into DSRM mode. But you can also create a really bad scenario, which is called a USN rollback in a multi-domain controller environment, if you aren't bringing these machines up in the directory services restore mode. So now, if you have a customer with multiple servers and they have their domain controllers, their Exchange servers, their SQLs, they've lost all their facilities, you're having to do a virtualization in the cloud, have a list. Thanks, Ted. Have a list of the order of the machines and when and which order they need to come up. Bring up your domain controllers first, then bring up your application servers, whether it's Exchange or SQL, then bring up your file servers, and bring them up in the proper order, because if you bring, as you know, if you try and bring up an Exchange server out of sequence, it's going to fail on you, and then you're going to spend some time troubleshooting that, opening tickets, trying to get to the resolution of it, when the reality was you needed proper communications with the domain controller. So definitely work that out before you run into that scenario. The next is, test these machines before you hand them over to the end user. The last thing in the world you want is to, because invariably this is always happening after hours, on a weekend, on a holiday, when it's the most inconvenient time for you. And you scramble as quickly as you can to get everything up and running as quickly as possible, and then you immediately turn over to the customer without testing the communications between everything. You may have a scenario where a customer has some proprietary web app with SQL on one machine and your web server on your other. And if you don't test it all, once you hand it over and your end user starts getting into the system and making modifications, and if it's not writing properly to machine number 2, but it's writing to machine number 3, you can now have mismatch of data, and you're now creating more work for yourself. So definitely test everything before you hand it over, because you're going to wind up doing extra work. Next item you should think about is calculating how long your customer is going to be in emergency mode, because this will dictate whether you've decided to make the call of declaring the actual disaster. Because there are lots of scenarios that could determine how you're going to handle the disaster once you made that, that declaration of a disaster. For example, if they're only going to be down overnight, let's say, you think there's, you have a next business day warranty, but you've made the decision to declare the disaster and you're going to bring them up, and the hardware manufacturer is going to be out there the next day because you have a blown RAID controller, a motherboard, and a piece of hardware, then bring it up on your BDR unit if you have to. If it's a complete loss scenario where they've lost all of their equipment and somehow the BDR has survived, or you need to go to the cloud to do your emergency virtualization of all your machines, think long and hard about the failback scenario. You may be able to get equipment back very, very quickly, brand new equipment. A lot of insurance providers out there provide what's called loss of productivity insurance, and your standard insurance policy is provided to these small businesses. If that's the case, and in advance is the time to have the conversation with your end user as well as the insurance provider, because if they have to cover lack of productivity in the insurance policy, it is a lot less expensive for that insurance provider to do a priority overnight of brand new hardware to your end user than it is to pay for downtime. Now, included in that downtime is if you do the emergency virtualization and then you have to fail them back, technically that can be more expensive than just priority overnighting the new hardware. If you're in a scenario where you can leverage the insurance company to do this and you have the plan worked out in advance with your end users, go ahead and order that equipment. You don't necessarily need to do the emergency virtualization. If you know that equipment is going to be there at 8 in the morning, you now have an opportunity to place the downed machines on their new permanent home. You can just simply go into your software, whoever it is, and export the data set and whichever virtualization layer you want. When that new hardware comes in, you can install the hypervisor of choice and then just copy over your virtual hard drive files, and you get the customer up and running. You've taken advantage of that time window in the plan where you did not actually have to spend the time, money, and effort to do the emergency virtualization. The customer's not working in a degraded mode. The next morning when the new hardware comes, all of those machines are now in their new permanent home as if nothing had ever happened, and you never went through the actual disaster scenario of the double failover, which is the failover into your BDR environment and then failing back into a new home for the servers. Which brings me to my next point. If you do have a failure, should you do a BMR to dissimilar hardware if new hardware comes in? Think about it. When you initially virtualize this machine, you've now done a full-blown P2V conversion of that machine. You have it up and running in whatever virtualized environment it is, whether it's Replibit or you're using VirtualBox, or you've converted it out into some other format, VMware, Hyper-V, whatever it may be. You've done a P2V conversion. A lot of times we've also seen in the past these machines that have now been converted into a virtual environment and are up and running in an emergency mode already had a BMR to dissimilar hardware prior to this event. So now you've done 2 of them. When it's time to fail back, think long and hard whether you want to do a 3rd BMR of this machine. Every time you do a BMR or a P2V conversion, you're messing with the hardware abstraction layer within Windows, and you're introducing a variable for long-term problems on that particular machine. So if you have declared a disaster and you do spin them up, we would recommend that you go ahead and leave them as a virtual machine. You can get them off the Replibit device or any other device that they're running on, but convert them into another virtualization format. It is not as damaging to Windows in the long run, and if you're doing these failback scenarios, most likely the reason you're doing that versus building all new instances of Windows is this customer plans on running those machines for several more years to come. Because if they weren't, at this point in time, you'd most likely have the conversation with them, well, let's take advantage of this time and rebuild your network anyway, and we'll get your data back onto these newer, more modern operating systems. But you're carrying the legacy of that. So highly consider not doing a BMR. You can introduce a variable that could be very, very problematic. Once it's already running as a VM, you really have a lot of flexibility of the conversion of the type of VM it is. These virtual hard drives are very, very similar. They just have slight variances in disk geometries and things like that. Those are very, very easy to tweak. It's much more difficult to recover from injection into the hardware abstraction layer of the particular piece of hardware. So I highly encourage you, regardless of what piece of software you're using, if you have invoked the disaster, when the new hardware comes in, throw a hypervisor on it. We don't care what type of hypervisor it is, and then just copy your virtual hard drives over, and in the long run, you're going to have fewer problems, your customer's going to be happier, and your cost of doing business is going to be lower because you're going to have fewer maintenance items on that particular machine. Now, oops, sorry, Ted, there's a slight delay here. I'm trying to get this back. All right. Now, with regard to success in meeting your SLA, the #1 factor besides paying attention to your alerts, every single alert that comes in so you can proactively mitigate issues before they become a disaster, is having the proper hardware in place. A little bit earlier, we talked about taking inventory of your customer's network and the RAM and the CPU and the hard drives. All of that comes into play on your hardware selection for the unit that you are putting in place. So before you make a decision of putting a unit in place, take a long look at your SLA and the service that you are providing. It seems to be the single point of when you look at those minimum hardware specs for performing disaster as a service, we're going to see virtualization component, the amount of RAM, the number of hard drives, and your BDR unit. If you roll out a unit, if you look, the end user has a single SQL line of business, and it may be a 3-year hardware. So you would look at that customer and
Hey, Andy? Andy, we're getting a little bit of, Andy, can you hear me? We're getting a little bit of, yeah, Andy, let's, I was worried it was me, but I think it's you. So team online, keep giving me feedback until we get Andy back here. Andy, can you hear me?
Ted, I can hear you.
Yeah, Andy, you're breaking up a bit. What I would do is I would just redial it. I would get that number jotted down and redial in. So because something went wrong with the phone line. So everybody, just give us 20 seconds here, and hopefully we get Andy back here shortly, and we'll take this slide from the top. Bear with me, everybody. Okay, just giving everybody an update. One of our panelists is having an audio problem and should be back momentarily.
Hey, Ted, are you able to hear me now?
I am. Yeah, I think we're good. So I think we started to have problems really pretty much at the top of this slide. So I would take it, yeah.
Okay.
So,
all right. Sorry about that, everyone. I apologize profusely. Don't know if it's a GoToMeeting or it was my phone. So I just dialed back in. So sorry about that. All right. So let's talk about minimum backup requirements and meeting your SLA. This is where we see partners miss their SLA, and it doesn't matter what solution you're providing. You know, earlier we talked about speccing out the particular environment that your end user has, the number of cores, the amount of RAM, the number of hard drives that they're running. When you look at your SLAs, generally speaking, they tend to be pretty aggressive, and that you're going to get the customer up and running as quickly as possible. But if you don't have the proper hardware, it becomes an impossibility, and you burn the goodwill with your end user customer. So take note of these minimum requirements, and this in particular is for Replibit. I'm sure every other vendor has minimum requirements as well. But these are for backups only. This does not take into consideration virtualization. So if you're building out an appliance and you're recycling hardware, or you're using repurposed hardware, or even if you buy new stuff, if you're going with a workstation grade solution and you have 4 cores and 8 gigs of RAM, that is going to perform your backups perfectly. But the moment you have to do an emergency virtualization, you're going to be under-spec'd. And the classic example that we see this on is a customer has an SBS server or a single SQL line of business application out there, and you look at it, you go, it's a single server, they only have 160 gigs of data. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to purchase a workstation or use a repurposed workstation. It will have 4 cores, it'll have 8 gigs of RAM, and I'm going to put a single 2 terabyte, 7,200 RPM SATA drive in that unit, and that's plenty of room to take the backups. And then the customer has a disaster, and you need to do an emergency virtualization. Well, what's going to happen is you're now doing non-sequential reads and writes on a 7,200 RPM SATA drive. You have maximum of 4 gigs of RAM running on the thing. You have to have enough RAM for ZFS, at least with regard to Replibit, enough RAM for ZFS to operate. Then you have the operating system, and now you're trying to put a virtual machine on top of there, and 8 gigs simply is not enough. In addition, on that 7,200 RPM hard drives, you don't have the I/O going in and out to be able to effectively have your VM running. Whenever we have this scenario, the VM runs very, very slow, and whenever we do a post-mortem and we look at that downed SBS or that downed SQL server, it may have been 3 or 4 years old, but invariably was a dual-core Xeon with 8 to 10, 15,000 RPM SAS drives. And now you're trying to do your emergency virtualization on a unit with a single 7,200 RPM hard drive in it, and you only have 8 gigs of RAM. 4 are being used by ZFS and the Replibit operating system, which leaves you less than 4 gigs to bring up that small business server. You're going to burn goodwill with your end user if that happens. So don't fall prey to the pressure from your end user to put a solution in as inexpensively as possible. What you want to do is do your end user a service and say, no, we're going to put in a solution that's going to meet your need. And then you can have the discussion of what their need is. They may say to you emotionally in their head, they may say, well, during that moment of emergency, I want this system to run identically as my production systems. And the answer is, that's easy to accomplish, but if you recall that piece of hardware that cost you $4,000 or $6,000 we put in 3 years ago, it's going to take that exact same piece of hardware to achieve the same performance. All of a sudden, their expectations change. They'll say, well, what's it going to cost to be in a slightly degraded mode? And now you're getting the price of that hardware down, but you're also aligning what their emotional expectations are versus the reality of the budget that they want to spend on the particular project. Don't just simply accept the answer of, I want to get this in as cheaply as possible, because that's how you lose a customer. You can completely mitigate that. Now, in addition to the minimum requirements for these backups, you know, if you're going to be backing up more machines, of course you need more cores and more RAM. And if you're going to be running the boot VM check, by default, every machine that we boot up, and we boot them up in a sequential fashion, so you know, it only uses the resource one at a time. But when we boot these up for your nightly boot VM checks, each one of those takes 2 gigs of RAM and 2 processor cores. So right out of the gate, if you're going 4 cores and 8 gigs of RAM, you're going to use that boot VM check because your SLA is for virtualization. You've already underspec'd the device. You know, these specs on the screen are for your backup only. This does not take into consideration the entire component of virtualization. And protect yourself from that downward pressure, because you're going to wind up in a sticky situation on a very uncomfortable phone call. And it's going to all be mitigated if you have that conversation in advance with the end user with regard to what their expectations are. I'm just waiting for the slide to change here. Hey, Ted, there we go. Now, just a couple things to know Replibit specific. We use ZFS as our file system. The ZFS project highly recommends using ECC memory. It's not a requirement, but it's highly recommended. You can have the most resilient copy-on-write file system that auto-corrects for errors, but if the data is coming out of RAM that cannot correct for errors that occur in RAM, you can wind up with a scenario of corrupted data on disk. So just keep that in the back of your mind, and you may want to budget a little bit more for ECC memory on these solutions that mitigates potential issues down the road. And you want to stack everything in your favor for a successful disaster recovery. And then when looking at the processor on these units, not all processors are created equal. There's one Xeon series out there that doesn't have any hyper-threading. So when you go to spec these devices and you go, oh, I'm just going to go with the Xeon processor, you may think that you're getting 8 processors in a hyper-threaded mode, but the reality is when you roll it out, you only have 4 processors. So take a look at the specifications on the hardware very carefully. You also may want to consider if you need to work within a budget, these i7 Haswell generation i7 processors are extremely powerful. Unfortunately, I don't believe those desktop processors allow for ECC memory. I may be wrong on that. So you have to take that into consideration that you're not going to be able to provide the ECC memory. But these processors are incredibly powerful, and you may want to consider just switching around your hard drives to be able to meet the SLA that you're providing the customer. For example, traditional methodology to get this unit in as inexpensively as possible would be using those SATA hard drives, but you're using a workstation-grade solution with a small chassis that can only hold 4 hard drives. You may want to have a discussion with the end user of, you know what, you as the MSP or the expert with regard to the ITs are going to make the decision to put SSDs in place. If you have an i7 processor with lots of RAM, most of these desktops now can take up to 32 gigs of RAM, and you have 2 or 3 SSDs in there warehousing the data set, when you go to do those emergency virtualizations, in all likelihood, that emergency VM is going to run more quickly than it did on its original hardware that's 4 years old. So there are all sorts of permutations you can do within the hardware selection that you make in order to meet this SLA. You know, most partners will go with a small, medium, and large, and then change the type of hard drive, whether it's SAS, SATA, or SSD, to work with the chassis, and you can actually wind up with 9 SKUs to meet your customer need and really hone it down and meet their budget. But definitely have the conversation with the customer, and don't fall prey to that downward pressure to put in an under-spec device. You will lose your customer if you do that. Hey, Ted, do you mind advancing the slide? There's a real long.
Yeah, you're on 3. You're on 3 on storage considerations.
What I'm looking at is, let me go to my paper, guys, because I'm still stuck on 2. So let me just switch to my backup. Let me just flip to the page. Apologize for the delay. Okay, storage considerations, and this is kind of Replibit specific. Local storage is always preferred over iSCSI storage. We see in the field fewer issues over time when you're running local storage in your devices. Your throughputs are faster. You don't have to worry about misconfigurations in your RAID array and communications across your LAN. We'll get to a little bit about proper configuration of iSCSI, but definitely consider, especially on the BDR units, have internal local storage or go with an external direct attached storage. Try and stay away from iSCSI. It's just an extra variable that causes a problem. Now, when selecting the hard drive controllers for these units, because we're using ZFS, and if you have elected to use the Z-RAID option built into Replibit, use an HBA, a host bus adapter, or a RAID controller with JBOD mode within the unit. Try to avoid using a RAID controller. It makes hard drive replacement very, very difficult. What happens is, if you have a RAID controller and you're electing to use the built-in ZFS RAID, which we highly recommend because then you can utilize a real-time resilver or ZFS real-time resilvering of data capability, which can get you out of a pickle down the road. So we definitely recommend using that. If you're using a RAID controller, what you have to do is go into the RAID card and configure individual RAID zeros. Those then present to ZFS. ZFS sees them. It then stripes either your RAID 5 or your RAID 6 It's actually called ZRAID 1 or ZRAID 2 across the system. The problem is if you lose a hard drive. If you lose a hard drive, the RAID controller is going to do what the RAID controller is designed to do, which is be consistent in its presentation of that hard drive. So when you pop out the hard drive and then pop in a new one, ZFS doesn't know that you changed the hard drive because that RAID controller is persisting the presentation of that drive. So you actually have to take your BDR unit offline, verify the disk that failed via serial number, then go into your RAID configuration and change, remove that RAID 0, create a new RAID 0 so you have a new GUID presented up to the ZFS data store, and then you can resilver or rebuild the dead RAID. If you go with an HBA or a RAID controller that supports JBOD mode, you don't have to worry about any of that stuff. ZFS will see each of those drives as though they were regular hard drives just plugged right into a motherboard on a workstation. And if you lose a drive, you simply swap it out and hit the replace button, and it'll resolver or rebuild the RAID array for you. And it takes a lot of pressure off of you, because if you pull the wrong drive and you only had a RAID 5 set, you've now lost 2 drives and you have the potential of destroying all your data. So we highly recommend going with HBAs or JBOD mode RAID controllers. If you're using iSCSI, please use 10G iSCSI. There is a lot of back and forth non-sequential reads and writes going in these backup sets. You know, we're not chain-based. There's a lot of churning of data on the back end to mitigate the scenarios of having chains, you know, and which can save difficulty down the road, especially over time with rebases and broken chains and all that kind of stuff. But single gig SATA can be problematic. You could have a SAN with 24 hard drives in it, each SATA 3 with a capability of 6 gigs of commit to disk, but you're limited to that single 1 gigabit storage link over iSCSI, and you can wind up with all sorts of failure scenarios. You can wind up with failed backups. You can wind up with your boot VM checks not working. You can have issues in replication because you can't get the data fast enough through that iSCSI link. So if you choose to go with iSCSI, absolutely ensure that you're using 10G iSCSI. Ted, can you tell me if the slide advanced?
Andy, why don't I just go? There we go. Yeah. Okay.
Great. Thank you very much. I can't see it yet, so I'm looking at slide number 4. So hopefully you guys are too. Now, hopefully everybody has a smile on their face when they're looking at this slide. This is not Replibit specific, but we see this all the time in the field. There is a good iSCSI configuration and a bad iSCSI configuration. I'm sure you all know when you build iSCSI, you're supposed to use either dedicated VLANs for your iSCSI storage or dedicated switching for your iSCSI storage. In many, many cases, we see flat implementations out there where you have your protected system, which are your production machines, plugged into a switch. Plugged into that same switch on the exact same VLAN is your iSCSI storage device, and then you also have your appliance. And they are all going across that same switch, all on the exact same virtual LAN or physical LAN, and that is extremely problematic with regard to mitigating issues with data recoverability. You may wind up with failed backups, missed backups. You go to recover something that's incredibly slow. It is because you are overwhelming your iSCSI connections. Good is how it should be. So definitely take the time and build out your storage VLANs if you're going to use iSCSI. Either put in these dedicated VLANs or go with dedicated switches, but it'll mitigate scenarios, bad scenarios when you have to do your emergency virtualizations. And this is all about lining things up and putting yourself in a good position to have a smooth recovery. If you have bad implementations, you're going to have a bad recovery. So everything I'm talking about is going to make your recoveries a lot smoother. Ted, do you mind advancing the slide?
Yep.
Great. So are we on tidbits?
Tidbits, yep.
Perfect. We're going to talk a little bit about choosing your snapshots and verifying your VM. So if you could advance one more time and let me know when that's done.
Choose your snapshot. Go ahead.
Perfect. Thank you very much. So if you have your boot VM check enabled and everything virtualized no problem at 2 a.m.,
and then something occurred overnight and you get a phone call from your customer, or your RMM tool identifies that you're having a problem on the production network, and you want to take the most recent backup and you go to virtualize it, and you have a problem with it. Ask yourself why. This holds true on all image-based block level backups. This is not Replibit specific, and this falls into the category of setting the proper expectation with your end user, because your midnight backup may virtualize no problem, but they lost a hard drive in the RAID set overnight, or the RAID controller started acting up and there was a problem with the RAID controller itself that reared its ugly head at 2 a.m. In image-based backup, assume that if you have a hardware failure of that type, that will be carried over into the backup sets. It is truly a garbage in, garbage out scenario, and it doesn't matter who the vendor is. So set the expectation of this scenario with your end user that you may have to roll back in time. Ask yourself what changed. Don't spend 6 hours beating your head against the wall trying to get the 8 a.m. backup to virtualize if you know there was a hardware failure to a degree, whether it's bad RAM on the RAID controller or a single bad hard drive and you've lost RAID integrity that occurred at 2 a.m. Roll back to before that. That is a good backup. You're going to miss your SLA. You're going to spend hours and hours and hours, and it doesn't matter whose software you're using. You're going to have all sorts of issues with that machine if you actually can get it up and running. So just ask yourself what went wrong. Take a deep breath, have the conversation with your customer that the best choice is to roll back in time. Hopefully, nothing was being changed overnight anyway. If you're in a 24/7 scenario, you need to prep your customer for that scenario because they wind up very upset if they don't understand this going in. Ted, do you mind advancing one more time?
Yep.
Cool. All right, I'm going to assume that slide's changed. So when you do your emergency virtualizations, your very first boot should be in safe mode or directory services restore mode. You have done a full P2V conversion of these down systems, and once again, it doesn't matter if it's us or if you're using a different hypervisor in the cloud or you've ported it over to something else. You've done your full-blown P2V conversion. Microsoft's best practices dictates on first boot, go into safe mode with networking. Let plug and play fire off. You have a whole new virtual hardware layer that needs to be installed. You want to make sure your drive letter assignments are correct. If this is a domain controller, as I talked about earlier, make sure you do it in directory services restore mode. Mitigate USN rollbacks, mitigate blue screens. But if it's an Exchange server, SQL server, even a file server, go into safe mode with networking. Let plug and play fire off. Make sure your drive letter assignments are right. A classic example is you've now changed the hardware layer under the hood. Microsoft is notorious for changing drive letters under that type of scenario. So if your Exchange data store now has a different drive letter, your registry is going to churn and your services are going to fail to start and Exchange isn't going to start. It could be as simple as going to Logical Disk Manager, verifying the drive letters. If they're incorrect, change the drive letter, then boot it in regular mode. Everything is going to come up beautifully, and you will save yourself lots of brain damage versus booting these all directly in live mode. If you're on a DHCP network, your device, you have a new MAC address, a new virtual NIC, put in the proper IP address at that point, and then do your reboot, and your virtualizations are going to go very, very smoothly. So with that being said, I'd like to turn this back over to Ted to talk about some other information.
Okay, Andy, thanks for all of these detailed suggestions and considerations partners need to take when building out a BDR service and plan for your clients. I want to, let's see here, what I want to do is remind everybody, we've got about 15 minutes left in today's presentation. I want to get to your questions, and so you keep the questions coming in the Q&A log. I'm just going to finish up with a couple comments about eFolder's service offering in this area. On today's call, we probably have a combination of partners that are maybe looking at Replibit, maybe some partners that have just gotten started, maybe have technically evaluated the product, are convinced that it's the right solution for you, but maybe haven't gone to full-blown deployments. and this is some good best practice coaching and advice from Andy, who's the engineered this product from scratch and is the CEO of Replibit. So we probably have a combination of folks. But what I want to just do is just in about 5 minutes here, you kind of explain how eFolder and Replibit work better together, touch on a couple of the advanced capabilities of the combined solution, touch on pricing really quick, and then dive right back in the Q&A log. So eFolder and Replibit, we work together. So we source the Replibit software and combine it into a service that we call eFolder BDR for Replibit. And it allows partners to go out there and deliver an end-to-end backup and disaster recovery service that leverages the power of the Replibit software plus the massive storage and recovery capabilities of the eFolder cloud. This is, how eFolder goes to market. What this allows us to do, of course, is to work with flavors of software that partners love and that have the most advanced capabilities, and then allow partners to really go out there and deliver a highly profitable and scalable business continuity service to your clients. So, just a picture tells 1,000 words. I mean, Andy's gone through, all of the detailed piece parts here, but what we do for partners is we add a Replibit vault running in the eFolder cloud for each partner that partners with us. We allow you to license the actual software components you need for the solution directly from eFolder. We add a massive amount of cloud storage per protected server in the eFolder cloud, and then we give you the ability to do cloud-based recovery if a worst-case disaster happens to a client and you actually need to virtualize and bring up their servers, not on-site on the BDR appliance, but actually in the cloud. Andy touched on a couple of these advanced capabilities you'll find in the Replibit solution, but the boot VM screenshot verification is really a killer app in our view. It's the sort of feature that allows you to validate the integrity of your backups, allow you to validate that you're going to be able to virtualize in the context of a disaster or an emergency. And then it also is integrated with the ConnectWise integration of the product so that you can actually log that in your ConnectWise instance to prove to your clients that you are testing these backups. And this is the sort of thing where it's automation, it's how the MSP business model works today to save money. I mean, you're able to wring labor out of the equation, take a task that was previously manual intensive and automate it. And this is what we find is one of the killer apps of the product that really gets MSP's attention. Andy didn't touch on this, but he could probably elaborate on it. But one of the things the Replibit software does is really deep verification checks of the integrity of the servers you're protecting. This requires a lot of care and attention for partners because what's being done here is pretty unique and will guarantee the reliability of the overall solution. The ConnectWise integration in the Replibit product is second to none, really. The product was built from the ground up for ConnectWise partners. We're getting ready to head into IT Nation here in about a day. And so, we as a company, we're making a ton of noise out here with this solution because the level and ease of using the ConnectWise integration is really fantastic in the Replibit product. And then as we talked about today, I mean, one of the great things, there's BDR vendors out there today that and service providers that really try to force you into using their appliance. And the Replibit software can run right on Linux, and you can build your own BDR appliances. Andy, of course, gave a ton of advice on how to properly spec those devices today. But this is again some flexibility, and I think it's really critical, and it allows partners to go out there and spec the right hardware for the BDR appliance, but to do it in a very cost-effective manner, because it's a very open way to how to deliver the actual appliance on site. So together, this powerful software from Replibit and the eFolder cloud and your expertise, some of which you've gathered today on today's webinar, allows you to go out there and deliver a business class, flexible and reliable and channel-ready business continuity solution. And then, kind of just the icing on the cake is the way we make the pricing really simple for partners. We price it per server. It includes all of the software components, the software for the appliance, the software agent for the protected machine, the global management portal software, and then we bundle in the cloud storage in a very massive amount so you don't need to worry about overages, and you can really get your head around your pricing strategy on a retail basis to your clients so that every month, if you're delivering disaster recovery as a service, you're able to lock in really attractive gross margins and recurring cash flow when you start to scale this solution out to your clients. So with that, what I want to do is go back into Q&A. We have a couple more minutes, and a couple questions that came through. Eric and Jonathan wanted to know, have we made recordings of this content? And we have, and we can make that available. We'll make that available to everybody who attended. And then we have a couple more minutes, and let's take your questions. So Andy, I'll just sling these your way as they come through. So Scott wants to know, what about eSATA for BDR storage?
Excellent question. We don't recommend, well, it depends on what type of eSATA. If it's a true direct attached storage JBOD eSATA, that's fine. And if you're using a multi-lane type of connection, if it's just an individual disk connected to a real low-end base eSATA card, we don't really recommend it because those types of scenarios are easy where somebody can inadvertently unplug it or power the unit off. And if that single eSATA disk was used to expand out a RAID set, you can break RAID integrity by doing that. But in theory, SATA, so you can implement that. We have lots of partners who are using, an Adaptec or an LSI HBA with a external connector on it, and just doing a SAS SATA JBOD cascade. Hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, it does. So George asks, can you talk a little bit more about how the ConnectWise integration works?
Sure. Happy to. So I think we have a pretty thoughtful ConnectWise integration. Everything in Replibit is really designed with automation in mind. We're trying to make your life a little bit easier. So when we wrote the ConnectWise integration, we said, okay, what in ConnectWise can we leverage to make your life easier and where you have less time tracking things down? So let me give you an example of things that we can do in ConnectWise. And it's a really easy setup. It's literally a 3 to 4 minute setup when you're connecting an appliance or vault to ConnectWise. But once you have it configured, we have the ability to open tickets, append tickets, and close tickets. And I'll get back to the importance of that in a minute. We will also add the devices into the ConnectWise inventory. We will, if you have your agreement table set up properly and your vaults and appliances both connected, we'll use the multiplier in your agreement tables to auto-populate your invoicing with the amount of offsite storage utilized. And we'll also auto-populate your executive summary so you can give your end user a nice pretty report at the end of the month. But back to appending and closing tickets, and this is really something that we feel that we're pretty proud of when we did the ConnectWise integration, was there's a concept within ConnectWise called escalation rules. And some of you on the call may know this, some it may be new to you, but you can build escalation rules based on time within ConnectWise. So if let's say you have a failed backup, we're going to go ahead and open a ticket for you. And then an hour later passes, and your next backup fires off, and it fails as well. Rather than flood your board and create a brand new ticket, what we're going to do is make the determination that with the same machine that failed, that you have an open ticket and ConnectWise on it, and we're going to go ahead and append your ticket. Then the third backup fires off, and it's successful. We have all sorts of self-healing in our software where we're heart beating between the agents and the appliances, and we're cycling services and all that stuff. That third backup is successful. We're going to go ahead and close the ticket, and it's going to disappear from your backup board. Now, if it were a failure and you had leveraged the automation rules in ConnectWise, when that third one failed, we would have appended the ticket a second time, but you could have built a rule in ConnectWise that says if a backup failure exists on the backup board for 3 hours or greater, then go ahead and alert the engineer responsible for that location or responsible for backups in general. you now have the flexibility to react to the types of alerts that you feel are important to you as an organization based on time. And we all know in the disaster recovery service business, time is the killer. If you don't know about it, you were never given an opportunity to fix it. And if you weren't given an opportunity to fix it, that's when your customer has an emergency something, whether it's an individual file restore or full-blown virtualization. So now you can build these rules and really base them on the type of alert that we're generating or creating in ConnectWise for you. So those failed backups, your threshold may be 3 hours, 4 hours. It could only be 2 hours. But an innocuous type of alert that you need to know about something that occurred but isn't necessarily critical, you may set a longer threshold and see if it self-heals, and then you can react to it when it's important for you as an organization.
Okay, great. So, interesting question. Bill would like to know, what is the timeline to provide auto task integration?
We are actively working on it. It is high on our priority list, and as long as their APIs allow us to follow the exact same methodology that we did with ConnectWise, we will do the same with auto task. I don't, off the top of my head, know when that's going to be ready. I'm hoping for the beginning of 2016, but please don't hold my feet to the fire on it.
Okay. Any final questions? Okay, well, we're just about out of time here. First of all, I want to thank our special guest today, Andrew Bensinger, CEO and founder of Replibit. Andy, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
And for everybody who tuned in, we appreciate your time and attention. We will be circulating the slides and a copy or a link to the copy of today's recorded webinar. We post everything to YouTube as well, so if there's staff members or colleagues who you want to share this with, it's usually very easy to do, with the different means we give to do that. And with that, I want to thank everybody for tuning in and sign off. This is Ted Hulsy, Vice President of Marketing at eFolder, and this was the eFolder Expert Series. Thanks a lot. Have a good day, everybody. Take care.